In the summer of 1966, inside a Los Angeles motorcycle dealership, a mechanic waited for a crate of engine parts that would never arrive. Across the Atlantic, the Plumstead factory in London had abruptly shut its doors. Associated Motorcycles, the parent company of Matchless, had filed for bankruptcy, liquidating its assets and severing a transatlantic supply chain overnight. The shockwave hit the American West Coast immediately. Independent dealers who had built their businesses around the heavy British machines were suddenly stranded. Parts catalogs became obsolete. Service bays could no longer honor warranties. Riders who had pushed the legendary Matchless G80CS to its absolute limits in the Mojave Desert were left scavenging for scrap components just to keep their engines turning. The paradox was absolute. The Matchless Heavy Single was still a feared weapon in American off-road racing, renowned for its relentless torque. It had not failed on the dirt, but the real story of Matchless in America is not only the story of a bankrupt London factory. It is the story of how an invincible machine was erased because the fragile distribution system that kept it alive completely collapsed. Every week, we tell the stories of the motorcycles, engines, factories, dealerships, and roads that once carried American industry, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, inside a struggling American Indian motorcycle dealership, just after the Second World War. In the late 1940s, the American motorcycle dealership was a fragile ecosystem. In Springfield, Massachusetts, the Indian Motorcycle Manufacturing Company was bleeding capital. Its traditional V-twin engines, two cylinders arranged in a V-shape around a shared crankshaft, built to pull heavy touring motorcycles across long highways, were becoming increasingly expensive to manufacture. More importantly, Indian's post-war attempts to build lightweight motorcycles had failed disastrously in both engineering and public trust. The consequence fell not on corporate executives but on the independent American dealers. Showrooms that had proudly displayed the Indian script for decades were suddenly starving for reliable inventory. A dealer cannot survive on brand loyalty alone. A dealer survives on units sold, parts ordered, and service bays kept busy. At the same time, thousands of miles away in Southern California, a new breed of American rider was emerging. Post-war veterans and young workers were taking stripped-down motorcycles into the Mojave Desert and the San Gabriel Mountains. They did not want 600-pound touring machines. They wanted a machine light enough to maneuver through deep sand and rocky inclines, but with enough low-speed pulling power to climb out of dry riverbeds. They needed torque, the twisting force produced by the engine that dictates acceleration, without the massive weight of a domestic cruiser. The American market had a gap. The dealers had empty floor space. The solution did not come from Milwaukee or Springfield. It came from a brick factory in southeast London. Associated Motorcycles, or AMC, was an industrial giant operating out of Plumstead, London. It was the parent organization that controlled the Matchless brand. While American factories focused on heavy cruisers, AMC had spent decades perfecting the large displacement single-cylinder engine, a power plant with one massive piston moving up and down inside a single cylinder to produce all the combustion force. The British had developed these heavy singles for their own trials and scrambling competitions, muddy, technical off-road courses that demanded immediate power at very low engine speeds. A Matchless 500 cubic centimeters overhead valve engine, an engine where the valves controlling air and exhaust sit above the combustion chamber, operated by push rods, was a masterpiece of mechanical simplicity. It was narrow. It was rugged. It could be repaired in a field with basic hand tools. By 1948, the Matchless competition singles were proving their durability in European events. But the Plumstead factory needed export revenue. Britain was rebuilding its post-war economy, and the government mandated that manufacturers sell their goods overseas to bring in foreign currency. AMC needed the American dollar. Indian dealers needed motorcycles to sell. The transatlantic bridge was built out of pure industrial desperation. In a corporate maneuver to save its collapsing retail network, the Indian Sales Corporation struck a distribution agreement with AMC. It was a surreal moment in American motorcycle history. An American rider walking into a traditional Indian dealership in 1949 or 1950, expecting to see domestic machinery, was instead greeted by the distinct upright silhouette of a British Matchless. The contrast on the showroom floor was striking. Beside the wide, low-slung American cruisers stood tall, narrow British machines with high ground clearance and polished aluminum engine cases. The Matchless did not look like an American motorcycle. It featured a chain drive, a metal roller chain transferring power to the rear wheel through toothed sprockets, which allowed riders to easily change gear ratios for different dirt tracks, a flexibility impossible with enclosed shaft drives. For the American dealer, the Matchless was a lifeline. It gave them a premium, high-performance product to sell to a younger, more aggressive demographic. It brought cash back into the registers and kept the service departments open. A mechanic who had spent his career adjusting American side-valve engines had to learn the clearances and quirks of British carburetors, the mechanical devices mixing gasoline and air before combustion, but the fundamental engineering was transparent and honest. The retail system was functioning again. The true test of the Matchless did not happen in the showroom. It happened on the weekends, in the vast, unforgiving expanses of the American West. When California desert racers stripped the lights and mirrors off the Matchless 500 cubic centimeter singles, they discovered a machine that felt almost telepathic in the dirt. The heavy flywheel mass of the Matchless engine meant it was extremely difficult to stall. A rider could drop the engine speed to a rhythmic chug to find traction in loose sand, open the throttle, and let the massive single piston deliver a tractor-like pulse of power that drove the rear tire forward instead of spinning it wildly. It was physical, demanding work. Starting a high-compression 500 cubic centimeter single required a kickstarter, a foot-operated lever used to manually turn the engine over. The rider had to find the exact point of top dead center, balance their weight, and drive their heavy boot downward with precision. But once running, the machine felt unstoppable. By the early 1950s, the Matchless name was shedding its identity as a strange British import. In the eyes of the American off-road racer, it was becoming the definitive tool for survival in the desert. The heavy British single had found its American riders in the dirt, and the Plumstead factory had secured its lifeline to American cash. But the market had not yet revealed how much that torque would cost when the racing became professional. The true breakthrough for Matchless in the United States did not happen in a corporate boardroom, and it did not happen on a paved American highway. It happened on a rugged, isolated rock off the coast of Southern California. In the early 1950s, the Catalina Grand Prix was the most punishing and prestigious off-road motorcycle race in America. The course was a brutal 100-mile sprint that forced riders through tight, twisting mountain switchbacks, deep dust, rocky fire roads, and brief stretches of island pavement. It was a landscape that ruthlessly exposed mechanical weakness. An American touring motorcycle was too heavy to navigate the hairpin turns. A lightweight two-stroke was too fragile to survive the prolonged abuse. Into this arena rolled the Matchless G80CS. The letters CS stood for competition suspension, and in the context of the American desert, those two words changed the entire showroom argument. Before the G80CS, many off-road motorcycles still relied on rigid frames, chassis designs with no rear suspension, where every rock and rut sent a violent shock directly into the rider's spine and bounced the rear tire off the dirt, destroying traction. The G80CS featured a swing arm, a hinged rear structure that lets the rear wheel move up and down with the suspension, keeping the tire pressed firmly against the ground over brutal terrain. Paired with a telescopic fork, the front suspension and steering assembly that uses sliding metal tubes and internal springs to absorb impacts before they reach the rider's hands, the Matchless could carry speed through rough desert washes that would physically break a rider on an older machine. But the suspension was only half of the equation. The heart of the breakthrough was the 500 cubic centimeter overhead valve engine. To understand why this specific engine dominated the California desert, one must understand the difference between how power is measured and how power is actually used in the dirt. At the time, British rivals like Triumph were heavily marketing the parallel twin engine, a two-cylinder engine with both cylinders standing side by side. A parallel twin spun faster and produced brilliant high-end horsepower, a measure of how quickly an engine can perform work, which sold motorcycles beautifully to riders focused on highway top speed. But out in the Mojave Desert, or climbing the steep ridges of Catalina Island, peak horsepower was largely irrelevant. If a rider opened the throttle of a high-revving twin in deep sand, the rear tire would simply break traction and spin frantically, digging a hole instead of moving the motorcycle forward. The Matchless single-cylinder engine did not spin frantically. It delivered torque, the twisting force produced by the engine, which dictates pure pulling power. Because the Matchless used one massive piston, every single combustion stroke delivered a heavy, distinct pulse to the rear wheel. A desert racer could drop the motorcycle down to a crawling speed, open the throttle, and feel the engine find grip in the dirt, driving the machine forward like a tractor. The heavy flywheels inside the engine kept the momentum going, making it incredibly difficult to stall even in the most technical, rocky sections. This mechanical reality created an engineering moat that American rivals simply could not cross. Harley-Davidson was committed to the V-twin engine, a massive power plant designed to move heavy police fleets and touring riders across the new interstate system. Milwaukee could not afford to stop its assembly lines to tool up a specialized 500 cubic centimeter single just for a few thousand desert racers in California. Because domestic manufacturers left the gap wide open, the Matchless G80CS became the ultimate weapon by default. When riders opened the pages of Cycle magazine or American Motorcyclist, they saw the distinctive winged M badge flying over desert jumps and dominating the podiums at Catalina and the legendary Big Bear Run. This racing supremacy translated directly into a retail phenomenon. At independent dealerships across the American West, the Matchless G80CS shifted from being a weird British import to a highly requested premium tool. A dealer in Los Angeles or Barstow no longer had to explain what the motorcycle was. The race results did the talking. However, buying a G80CS required a specific type of commitment. It was not a machine for casual weekend commuters. It was tall, heavy, and physically demanding. Starting it required mastering the Kickstarter, a foot-operated lever that the rider kicks downward to manually rotate the engine through its compression stroke. Because the 500 cubic centimeter single had such immense internal pressure, the rider had to use a compression release valve, a small handlebar lever that temporarily holds an engine valve open to bleed off cylinder pressure, allowing the rider to ease the heavy piston into the exact right position before delivering a full-body kick. If a rider got the sequence wrong, the Kickstarter would violently kick back, easily hyperextending a knee or spraining an ankle. But to the American desert racer, this physical toll was simply the price of admission. The drum brakes, a braking system where internal shoes press outward against a rotating metal drum, would often fill with fine desert dust and fade during a long race. But the engine braking of the big single was so strong that riders simply relied on the motor to slow them down. By the mid-1950s, the parts counters at Southern California dealerships were moving incredible volumes of Matchless components, gaskets, Chains, sprockets, and clutch plates were constantly being ordered to keep the desert racing fleets operational. The British factory at Plumstead was running at full capacity, turning raw aluminum and steel into the exact kind of torque the American West demanded. The heavy British single had found its ultimate proving ground. The G80CS looked invincible crossing the finish line at Catalina. But across the Atlantic, the factory that built it was already running out of time. By the late 1950s, the Indian Sales Corporation had entirely collapsed, taking the last remnants of the old Springfield distribution empire with it. But Matchless did not disappear from the United States. The British heavy single was simply too valuable, and the American off-road market was expanding too rapidly to abandon. The Plumstead factory needed a new American artery to survive, and it found one in the Berliner Motor Corporation. Operating out of New Jersey, Joseph and Michael Berliner had built a massive independent distribution network that aggressively pushed European motorcycles into American dealerships. When Berliner took over the Associated Motorcycles portfolio, the Matchless G80CS entered its golden era in the United States. The Berliner brothers understood that American dealers did not just need motorcycles, they needed a relentless supply of parts, aggressive marketing, and a reliable warranty system. Under Berliner's control, the Matchless badge moved from being a desperate substitute in dying Indian showrooms to a premium, standalone powerhouse. The Plumstead factory was shipping thousands of motorcycles across the Atlantic, sustained almost entirely by American dollars. At a time when a domestic American cruiser cost a premium, the Matchless 500 cubic centimeters single commanded its own high price tag, often selling for over $800. It was a massive investment for a working-class rider, but in the brutal environment of the Mojave Desert, durability justified the expense. The Berliner distribution network expanded to include hundreds of independent dealerships from the East Coast to the Pacific. A dealer in rural Nevada or a shop in upstate New York could order a Matchless and know that a crate of factory-authorized spare parts would follow. The parts counter became the true lifeblood of the brand. A motorcycle is only as good as the availability of its replacement gaskets, piston rings, and wheel bearings. Berliner ensured that when an American rider broke a machine in a canyon on Sunday, the local dealer could have them back on the dirt by the following weekend. To understand the sheer scale of this peak, one must look inside a Southern California dealership on a Friday night in January, just before the legendary Big Bear Run. The showroom floor in Los Angeles was completely cleared of standard commuter models. Instead, the service bays were overflowing with Matchless G80CS machines. The air smelled heavily of raw gasoline, hot oil, and tire rubber. Mechanics worked feverishly under harsh overhead lights, adjusting the primary drive. The heavy metal roller chain enclosed in an aluminum case that transferred twisting force from the engine's crankshaft to the transmission. Because the 500 cubic centimeters single produced such violent, heavy power pulses, the primary chain required constant tensioning and inspection to prevent it from snapping under the strain of deep desert sand. At the parts counter, clerks were handing over specialized sprockets, clutch friction plates, and heavy-duty control cables to privateer racers. In the back of the shop, a mechanic was fine-tuning a carburetor float bowl, the small internal reservoir inside the carburetor that holds a constant level of fuel before it is sucked into the engine. Desert racing meant extreme vibration and steep, rocky inclines, which could cause fuel to foam or starve the engine if the float level was not set with absolute precision. This was not merely a retail transaction. It was an American ritual of survival. The dealership was the staging ground where British engineering was fortified for American geography. The Matchless was fundamentally honest in its construction. There were no fragile electronics, no complex multi-cylinder timing issues, and no hidden computer codes. If the engine stopped in the middle of a dry lake bed, a rider with a basic tool roll could pull the spark plug, adjust the push rods, clean the carburetor, and kick the massive piston back to life. Advertising in cycle and American motorcyclist magazines did not focus on chrome or highway comfort. It focused on the brutal reality of winning. The winged M logo became synonymous with an uncompromising heavy-duty approach to the American outdoors. By 1960, the motorcycle had fully established its market dominance. But the American desert is a ruthless laboratory, and to stay ahead of the competition, the factory in London would have to push its traditional engineering to the absolute limit of what the metal could withstand. To grasp the cultural weight of Matchless in America during the early 1960s, one must look at the starting line of the Big Bear Run or the Greenhorn Enduro. Hundreds of motorcycles idled in the frigid high desert air, their exhausts creating a thick, pulsing fog. Among them, the Matchless G80CS stood as the undisputed heavyweight champion. The winged M on the fuel tank had become a symbol of absolute endurance. The men who rode them were not casual hobbyists. They were mechanics, fabricators, and off-road purists. They brought the British machines into their garages and stripped away everything that did not make the motorcycle faster or tougher. They removed heavy steel fenders, replacing them with lightweight aluminum. They rerouted the exhaust pipes high along the frame to clear deep ruts, rocks, and sagebrush. The Plumstead factory had built a massive, durable foundation, but the American garage perfected it for the brutal reality of the Mojave. Because of this intense racing culture, the Berliner Motor Corporation was importing thousands of units across the Atlantic. Dealerships from California to Texas relied heavily on the profit margins of these premium British singles. The parts counters were constantly moving inventory. Clutches, primary chains, sprockets, and control cables were sold as fast as they could be unboxed. For a local motorcycle dealer, the Matchless was a reliable economic engine. A rider who bought a G80CS would return continuously for specialized service, tuning advice, and the spare parts required to survive the weekend. If this motorcycle disappeared from American showrooms, the off-road market would not simply lose another imported machine. It would lose a particular combination of weight, sound, repairability, and trust that a generation of desert racers had learned to depend on. In an independent dealership, the Matchless did not merely carry a badge. It carried the service department's payroll, the parts counter's inventory, and the weekend ambitions of American riders who demanded honest engineering. While the American racer was busy adjusting carburetor jets in the California sun, the reality in London was very different. The Plumstead factory was a sprawling, traditional industrial complex where thousands of British workers machined engine cases, laced spoked wheels, and painted fuel tanks by hand. The factory relied on older manufacturing methods and outdated tooling. The financial health of these workers and the local economy of southeast London was directly tied to how many motorcycles Joseph Berliner could sell in the United States. It was an incredibly fragile transatlantic bridge. The American dealer needed the Plumstead assembly line to keep running, and the Plumstead assembly line needed the American rider to keep winning. But pushing a large displacement single-cylinder engine to make more power has inevitable physical consequences. The basic architecture of the Matchless engine dated back to before the Second World War. To keep up with the increasing demand for speed on long desert straightaways, American mechanics began pushing the British metal to its absolute limits. They installed higher compression pistons, a modification that squeezed the fuel and air mixture tighter before ignition, creating a much more violent explosion inside the cylinder. They fitted aggressive camshafts to keep the overhead valves open longer, drawing in more fuel. These modifications made the G80CS incredibly fast, but they also amplified its inherent flaws. The 500 cubic centimeter single vibrated fiercely at high engine speeds. The massive piston moving up and down shook the frame, the main structural skeleton holding the motorcycle together, so hard that it demanded constant tightening of engine mounts and chassis bolts. The vibration caused stress fractures in metal components. It caused the traditional British oil sealing methods to fail, leading to weeping engine cases and frequent oil top-offs. The electrical system was notorious for failing under the relentless pounding of the American desert. The G80CS was a brilliant machine, but it was reaching the absolute ceiling of its 1930s-based architecture. There was only so much horsepower a single massive cylinder could produce before the vibration and heat destroyed the engine from the inside out. Yet in 1962, the sales were at their peak. The American magazines still praised the relentless torque. The West Coast dealerships were full of eager buyers. The parts supply was flowing smoothly from London to New Jersey to Los Angeles. The brand appeared stronger than ever, but a motorcycle empire cannot survive on one aging design alone. The G80CS still dominated the California dirt, but the transatlantic supply chain that kept its engine turning had already begun to fracture. The first crack in the Matchless empire did not happen in a corporate boardroom in London, and it did not sound like a bankruptcy declaration. It sounded like a high-pitched metallic buzz echoing across a dry lake bed in California. In the early 1960s, a Matchless G80CS rider leading a local desert race could easily stall his engine in a deep sand wash. Starting a hot, high-compression 500 cubic centimeter single under the blazing sun was an exhausting physical penalty. The rider had to find neutral, pull the compression release, position the heavy kickstarter, and deliver a massive, perfectly timed downward strike. As the Matchless rider struggled in the heat, a new sound would approach and quickly fade into the distance ahead of him. It was a Swedish Husqvarna or a Japanese Yamaha. These new rivals were powered by a completely different kind of engineering. They used a two-stroke engine, an internal combustion engine that completes a power cycle in just 2 piston strokes, firing every single time the piston reaches the top of the cylinder. A two-stroke produced aggressive, explosive power, but more importantly, it lacked the heavy valves, push rods, and massive internal flywheels of the British four-stroke. The American off-road market was experiencing a ruthless technology displacement. A two-stroke desert racer weighed hundreds of pounds less than a Matchless. When a rider hit a rocky incline or a deep rut, the lightweight import floated over the terrain, while the heavy British single had to batter its way through. If a two-stroke stalled, a tired rider could flick the light kickstarter with a casual downward push and be moving again in seconds. This shift in performance changed the economic reality inside the American motorcycle dealership. A working-class rider walking into a showroom in Southern California now faced a clear choice. They could spend a premium price on a heavy Matchless that vibrated fiercely and required constant mechanical vigilance, or they could spend less money on a lightweight European or Japanese two-stroke that was easier to ride, easier to start, and increasingly faster in the dirt. As foreign imports grew in popularity, they also changed the American expectation of reliability. A Japanese motorcycle did not mark its territory with a puddle of oil on the showroom floor. The traditional British manufacturing method, which relied on older machining tolerances and vertically split engine cases, inherently seeped oil. For years, American racers had accepted this as the normal price of riding a serious machine. But as competitors introduced perfectly sealed, leak-free engines, the British oil leaks stopped being a badge of rugged character. They became a symbol of outdated engineering. The electrical systems were equally problematic. Matchless motorcycles relied on Lucas electrical components, the British-made magnetos, dynamos, and wiring harnesses that provided spark to the engine and power to the lights. Under the brutal vibration of the 500 cubic centimeter single and the relentless pounding of the American desert, the Lucas components frequently shattered, shook loose, or simply failed. Vibration, the intense mechanical shaking produced by the massive single piston, was not just a comfort issue, it was a destructive force. It cracked steel frame tubes, it snapped metal fenders, It vibrated carburetor parts loose mid-race. A rider could build the strongest engine in the world, but if the Lucas magneto stopped delivering an electrical spark, the motorcycle became nothing more than 300 pounds of dead British steel stranded in the sand. By 1964, the American dealer network was feeling the structural pressure. The Berliner Motor Corporation was still importing the Matchless singles, but the motorcycles were sitting on the showroom floors much longer. The parts counters were still busy repairing older models, but new unit sales were stalling. Dealership owners, who survived on tight square footage and thin profit margins, began quietly making floor space for lighter, cheaper machines that moved out the door faster. The Matchless was not suddenly a bad motorcycle. It still produced the same relentless torque. It was still built with the same heavy-duty materials. But the market forces of technology displacement and foreign competition had fundamentally moved the baseline. The American rider no longer wanted to fight a heavy machine for 100 miles if a lighter machine could conquer the same desert with half the physical effort. The American off-road market had learned how to fight light, and as the transatlantic orders from Los Angeles began to slow, the fragile financial foundation back in London began to crumble. While the American rider was deciding between a heavy British thumper and a lightweight Japanese two-stroke, the Plumstead factory, Bassi was fighting a completely different war. Associated Motorcycles was bleeding capital. While foreign competitors were investing in automated assembly lines, precision tooling, and modern metallurgy, the London factory remained trapped in older manufacturing methods. They could not afford to design a new, lightweight engine platform from scratch, and they lacked the resources to re-engineer the G80CS to stop its oil leaks and electrical failures. This financial rot in Britain immediately infected the American retail network. A motorcycle dealership operates on a very simple premise. A mechanic must be able to fix what the sales floor sells. By 1965, the transatlantic supply chain that kept Matchless alive in the United States began to severely fracture. When a California desert racer broke a transmission gear or blew a cylinder head gasket, they expected the local dealer to have the replacement on the shelf. But the parts bins at the Berliner Motor Corporation's New Jersey warehouse were taking longer to restock. An American mechanic waiting on a crate from Plumstead might find his service bay paralyzed for weeks. A dealer cannot survive if broken motorcycles are taking up valuable floor space while waiting for overseas shipping. Slowly, quietly, independent shop owners stopped accepting Matchless motorcycles on trade-in, fearing they would not be able to source the parts to refurbish them for resale. Joseph Berliner, watching his premium off-road market slip away, made one final desperate demand of the Plumstead factory. He knew the 500 cubic centimeter single was losing its speed advantage to high-revving twins and lightweight two-strokes. To fight back, Berliner demanded a machine and built exclusively for the American market, a motorcycle with so much pure torque that it could simply overpower the competition. The British factory responded by stretching their aging architecture to its absolute physical limit. They introduced the Matchless Typhoon. By increasing the engine displacement, the total volume swept by the piston inside the cylinder to a massive 600 cubic centimeters, Plumstead created a brutal, uncompromising weapon for the American desert. The Typhoon was not a technological leap forward. It was a hammer. It was designed to pull an American rider through the deepest sand washes of the Mojave Desert at terrifying speeds. But physics demands a price. The massive 600 cubic centimeter piston generated even more violent vibration than the 500 cubic centimeter version. It shook the frame harder, it stressed the engine mounts further, and it made the motorcycle notoriously difficult to kickstart. A rider who failed to perfectly align the compression release on a Typhoon risked a kickback severe enough to break their foot. When the Typhoon finally reached American showrooms, the contrast was devastating. It sat on the dealership floor as a highly expensive, violently vibrating heavy machine that required immense physical strength just to start. Right across the street, a customer could buy a Japanese scrambler that weighed half as much, cost significantly less, and featured an electric starter, a battery-powered motor that spun the engine to life with the simple push of a button. The American definition of off-road performance had shifted from rugged, heavy-duty endurance to accessible, lightweight speed. The Typhoon was a brilliant piece of traditional engineering, but it was a bandage on a fatal wound. It could not save the dealership network, and it could not save the Plumstead factory. In 1966, the financial strain finally broke the parent company. Associated Motorcycles collapsed into receivership. The sprawling London factory was eventually shuttered. The corporate assets were liquidated and absorbed into a new conglomerate, and production of the Matchless heavy single was abruptly halted. Overnight, the transatlantic lifeline was cut. Berliner could no longer order the motorcycles. The remaining American dealers were left holding inventory from a company that essentially no longer existed. The desert racers who relied on the G80CS and the Typhoon were suddenly riding orphaned machines. The catalog shrank. The dealers stopped ordering. The parts bins emptied. The repair queue stopped. The Typhoon arrived too late. The Plumstead factory closed. The heavy single remained. The American market moved on. When Associated Motorcycles collapsed in 1966, the Matchless name did not immediately vanish from the earth, but its engineering soul was hollowed out. The British government intervened, forcing a desperate consolidation that rolled the remnants of AMC into a new industrial conglomerate called Norton Villiers. The historic Plumstead factory, the brick-and-mortar heart of the brand, was slated for closure and eventually demolished to make way for a housing estate. To clear out the remaining inventory of frames and parts, the new management took the legendary Matchless winged M badge and slapped it onto a hybrid machine called the G15. The motorcycle used a Norton twin-cylinder engine jammed awkwardly into a Matchless chassis. It was a cynical exercise in corporate badge engineering, the practice of putting a respected brand name on an unrelated product just to make a sale. For the American desert racer, it was a final insult. The heavy, torque-producing British single that had conquered Catalina Island was officially dead. The name remained on the fuel tank, but the manufacturing culture behind it was a ghost. In the United States, the collapse left thousands of G80CS and Typhoon models completely orphaned. Joseph Berliner and the Berliner Motor Corporation had to pivot their business to survive, focusing their importing efforts on Italian brands like Ducati and Moto Guzzi. The Matchless owners were cut adrift. At independent dealerships across the American West, mechanics quietly swept the remaining Matchless gaskets, valves, and clutch plates into cardboard boxes and shoved them onto the highest, dustiest shelves in the stockroom. As the 1970s arrived, the lightweight two-stroke revolution completely conquered the American dirt. The heavy Matchless singles were pushed into the dark corners of California garages, left under canvas tarps in Nevada barns, or sold for pennies at local swap meets, outdoor markets where riders trade used parts. The industrial supply chain that birthed them was gone, and without factory support, the motorcycles were reduced to static metal. But a machine built to survive the brutal impacts of the Mojave Desert does not decay easily. Decades after the Plumstead assembly line went silent, a distinct subculture began to form within the American Historic Racing Motorcycle Association, or AHRMA. In the paddocks of vintage motocross tracks across the United States, a new generation of mechanics, fabricators, and riders began pulling the old Matchless singles out of the barns. This resurrection created an entirely new, decentralized economy. Today, at massive events like the Barber Vintage Festival in Alabama, you can walk through the swap meets and find vendors selling original new old stock, parts manufactured decades ago but never sold or used, guarded like precious industrial artifacts. At the Mecum motorcycle auctions in Las Vegas, a correctly restored Matchless G80CS no longer sits in a dark corner. It crosses the auction block for $15,000 to $20,000. Purchased by collectors who recognize its place in the timeline of American off-road racing. However, the true legacy of Matchless is not found on an air-conditioned auction block. It is found on the oil-stained workbenches of independent American machine shops. Because the original London factory is gone, American enthusiasts have essentially rebuilt the supply chain from scratch. Small, specialized manufacturing outfits in the U.S. now use modern CNC machining, computer-controlled cutting tools that shape metal with absolute precision, to mill new aluminum engine cases, cut stronger transmission gears, and forge high-compression pistons that are far superior to the original British components. The motorcycle outlived its corporate creator, and the American aftermarket learned how to manufacture the vital organs that London could no longer provide. When a modern American rider spends thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours rebuilding a Matchless 500 cubic centimeter single, they are not buying into a romantic illusion. This is not nostalgia. It is an investment in mechanical honesty. A Matchless single is an entirely transparent piece of engineering. A rider can look at the external pushrod tubes, the exposed oil lines, and the heavy aluminum cylinder barrel, and understand exactly how the internal combustion cycle is occurring. There are no black box electronics, no software updates, and no proprietary diagnostic computers required. You can hear a valve clearance issue before it destroys the engine. You can feel the massive pulse of torque through the handlebars. If the carburetor mixes air and fuel, and the magneto delivers an electrical spark, the heavy metal piston will fall, and the engine will run. It is a physical agreement between a rider, a wrench, and a piece of steel, a relationship that modern, disposable manufacturing has largely erased. If you travel to Plumstead, London today, you will not find a plaque commemorating the factory that built the motorcycles that once dominated the American West. The brick buildings are gone. The industrial noise of the assembly line has been silent for over half a century. But the engineering remains exactly where it belongs. In a small, dust-lit garage in Southern California, an American mechanic opens a fuel petcock, pulls the compression release, and drives a heavy boot down onto the Kickstarter. The old 500 cubic centimeter single turns over twice, coughs, and settles into a deep, uneven, heavy rhythm. Its metal warm, its parts scavenged and machined by hand, still ready to carry one more rider out into the desert dirt. See you in the next one.